My daughter looked me in the eye, then laughed and said, "This house is ours now." That was the moment the floor gave way under me. Not because I believed her, but because I realized how far she had gone. A man can be cut by a stranger's words and heal by the next morning. But when your own flesh and blood mocks you in your own living room, you feel the wound settle into your bones. The house we stood in was not just lumber and nails. I had raised its beams with my own hands after long days at the factory driving screws, with palms blistered from overtime shifts. Every dent in the kitchen table, every scratch in the banister carried a story of our family's years. I remember the Christmas mornings when the kids slid down the staircase in sleeping bags, screaming with laughter. I remember my wife, God rest her soul, baking pies in the oven that still rattled when you closed it. To me, the place was more than property. It was my map of time. My daughter Claire had once been that little girl who followed me with a hammer too big for her hand, pretending to help me nail shingles. Now she stood with manicured fingers folded across her chest, her husband smirking behind her. She wasn't asking for the house. She was telling me, "Your old dad," she said with a sharpness that cut the word in two. "You don't need all this space. It's our turn. You should be grateful." I remember gripping the arm of the chair to keep myself steady. The way she said our turn felt like she was laying claim to a prize she had earned. But she had not carried the mortgage. She had not eaten cold beans at the kitchen counter when I was laid off, and the heating oil ran out. She had not stayed up nights fixing pipes, patching roofs, sanding floors. She wanted the house as a trophy, not a home. Her husband, Mark, leaned against the wall, all smug in his pressed shirt. "We'll make better use of it," he said. "A young family deserves a real place to grow. You can move into something smaller, maybe senior housing. It'll be good for you." That phrase, "good for you," stung worse than anything, like I was some burden to be tucked away. I tried to keep my voice even. "This house is in my name," I said. "It stays that way until I say otherwise." Claire laughed again, louder this time, like she was humoring a senile old man. "Not anymore, Dad. Papers have been signed. It's done." The words hung there. I could hear the old clock ticking in the hallway, the same clock I had wound every Sunday for 30 years. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I didn't shout. I didn't throw them out. But inside a storm rose. If papers had truly been signed, someone had forged them. If they were bluffing, they were crueler than I ever believed. I sat back in my chair, looking at the photographs on the mantel faces, smiling from years gone by. My wife, our children, Christmas cards, graduations. I thought of all I had given, how I had measured my life by what I could hand down. Now my own daughter treated me as if I were a guest in my own story. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing her voice saying, "It's ours now." I wondered how much of her heart had turned to stone, and when. The next morning, as sunlight slid across the faded curtains, the phone rang. I answered, expecting maybe a neighbor, maybe the pharmacy. Instead, a clear voice said, "This is Helen from Riverbend Realty. We're calling to confirm your listing. Is this still a good time to show the house?" My hand froze on the receiver. My daughter had told me the house was hers. Yet here was a realtor calling me directly, asking to show a property that was still under my name. I stared out the window at the yard I had mowed 1,000 times, the oak tree, where Claire once hung her tire swing. A bitter taste filled my mouth. Whatever game they were playing, it was about to unravel. I cleared my throat and said, "Yes, this is a fine time." And that was the moment I decided I would not be the one left trembling. If they wanted a war over the house, they were about to learn who truly owned it. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. I stayed on the line with the realtor longer than I needed, asking questions in a steady voice, taking down her notes, as if we were talking about someone else's house. My pen scratched the paper slowly, each word making it clearer that nothing had changed on the deed, nothing had been signed away, nothing had slipped from my hands. When I finally hung up, I just sat there staring at the pad on my desk, the words tilting back and forth in my vision, like they didn't quite belong to this world. The house was still mine. Yet the sound of Claire's laughter lingered bitter and sharp, as though she had carved her voice into the walls. I could not shake the question of how my daughter had come to that point. A girl who once clutched my pant leg when thunder cracked the night sky, now stood in my living room with her husband declaring me obsolete. I walked slowly through the rooms that morning. My knees ached the way they always did when the weather was changing, but I let the pain guide me step by step past the kitchen, the hall, the bedrooms. Each door carried its own ghosts. Claire's old room still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets her mother used to tuck in her dresser drawers. My son Michael's room, empty for years, kept the outline of his baseball posters faded on the paint. Even the bathroom with its cracked tiles and medicine cabinet I had repaired 3 times seemed to breathe with memory. This house was a ledger of my life. Every nail I had hammered, every bill I had paid, every corner I had polished when my wife wanted the place ready for Christmas Eve dinners. I felt as though the house itself had been listening, waiting to see how I would respond to Claire's claim. I settled into my chair in the living room. The springs groaned familiar and weary, like an old friend leaning close. I thought about my wife. She had been gone 10 years now, and sometimes I still caught myself turning toward the kitchen, expecting her to be there, wiping flour from her hands. I wondered what she would have said if she had been here yesterday when Claire laughed. I imagined her frown the way she would place both hands on the counter and ask our daughter why she had turned her heart so hard. What stung most was not the threat of losing the house, but the quiet revelation that my daughter had already crossed that line in her mind. It was as if she had buried me alive, written me off, while I was still sitting upright and breathing. A man can fight foreclosure, he can fight disease, but how does he fight the betrayal of blood? I tried to trace it back. Maybe it began years ago when I refused to co-sign a loan she wanted, afraid her spending would bury her. Maybe it was when I told her husband that quick money schemes never last. I had thought I was protecting her, but maybe in her mind, I had only stood in her way. The day stretched on long shadows sliding across the carpet. I found myself at the kitchen sink, staring into the yard. The oak tree still stood strong, bark thick and ridged roots deep in soil that had known our family longer than Claire's husband had known her. That tree had held the swing, the birdhouses, even the rope lights we strung for neighborhood cookouts. It was a witness to our joy, and now to this fracture. As dusk settled, I set a pot of coffee and sat back at the table with the papers spread before me. The realtor's words were clear. My name remained bold and unshaken on every line. If my daughter had been so sure, she had either been lied to or had chosen to lie herself. Both possibilities carried their own kind of poison. A knock rattled the front door just as I poured my cup. The sound jolted me sharp against the quiet. When I opened it, Claire stood there alone this time. She had no laughter now. Her face was pale, her eyes restless, darting behind me into the house, as if checking to see if it was still hers. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling against the evening air, "we need to talk." Her tone was not the triumphant declaration of yesterday. It was urgent, almost fearful. Something had changed in the hours since she had mocked me in this very room. And from the way her hands fidgeted at her sides, I knew whatever it was would cut deeper than I had yet imagined. Claire stood in the doorway like a shadow that had lost its way. I could see the outline of the oak tree behind her branches reaching over her shoulders, as if the night itself was pressing her inside. Her lips trembled, as though words fought each other in her mouth. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. My voice was even, but I felt a knot tightening deep in my chest. She walked past me, her eyes flicking to the photographs on the mantel the chair I had sat in when she declared the house hers, the coffee cooling on the table. She looked smaller than yesterday, her confidence stripped raw. "Dad," she whispered, "I didn't mean what I said. I was upset." I waited. Silence in a room has weight, and I let it press on her. She wrung her hands. "Mark said everything was set. He told me the papers were taken care of. He said the house was ours, that you had already agreed." There it was. The first cut. Not a knife wound, but a scratch across years of trust, small enough to be dismissed, deep enough to leave a scar. My own daughter had not come to me first. She had trusted her husband's word over mine. "You believed him without asking me," I said. Her shoulders slumped. "I didn't want to fight. He said you signed, and I thought maybe you just didn't tell me because it was hard." I laughed then, not from humor, but from disbelief. "You thought I gave away this house and kept it secret?" Claire looked down, her cheeks pale. "I don't know what I thought. I only know that I wanted it to be true." The words landed heavier than any argument. She wanted it to be true. My blood, my child wanted me gone from this house. That truth stung sharper than the lie itself. I turned away, my eyes landing on the kitchen table. The wood bore faint circles from years of coffee cups, burn marks from candles, scratches from my children's homework pencils. That table had been our anchor. Now my daughter's words sat on it like ashes. "Mark said we could renovate." She went on, her voice gathering urgency. "He said the place would finally look like it belonged to people our age, not stuck in the past. He said we could get money out of it, flip it if we needed." I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles whitened. All those nights of patching the roof, repairing the plumbing, sanding, the floors dismissed as stuck in the past. The house wasn't a pile of lumber. It was a vessel of memory, and they had reduced it to a bank slip. "What else did he say?" I asked. She hesitated, then confessed. "He said you were slipping, that you weren't keeping up, that it would be better for everyone if we handled things." Handled things. Those words burned. I still mowed my own lawn, paid my bills, fixed my gutters. My knees hurt, my back ached, but I had not surrendered my independence. Yet in their eyes, age itself was weakness, and weakness was a reason to take. I looked at my daughter long and hard. She was 38 years old, hair-styled, sharp clothes, expensive nails painted in the latest color. Yet her eyes had that flicker of the little girl who once begged me to push her higher on the swing. That flicker made the betrayal cut deeper, because it reminded me of what I had lost. "You came here tonight," I said slowly, "because something changed. What is it?" Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter. Her hands shook as she held it toward me. I took it, smoothing the paper flat against the table. It was a notice from the bank, a past due warning addressed to Mark. Their debts had piled up higher than they admitted. They had pinned their hope on this house, on turning my life's work into their lifeline. I set the letter down carefully. "So this is why. Not because you love this place, not because you need me closer, but because you are drowning in debt." Tears filled her eyes, but I had no room for softness. "Not now," she whispered. "I didn't know until today." "I swear, Dad, I didn't know how bad it was. When the realtor called you instead of Mark, I realized something wasn't right. He told me it was all arranged, but it isn't, is it?" I shook my head. "The house is mine. Still mine." Her breath hitched. For the first time in years, she looked like she feared me, not my fists, not my voice, but the strength she had underestimated. The clock ticked in the hallway, marking the moment like a gavel. Claire pressed her palms flat on the table as though bracing against an unseen wave. Then her voice cracked. "Mark doesn't know I came here tonight. If he finds out, it'll get worse. He's not giving up Dad. He's already planning something else." The words lodged in the air, heavy and final. Something else. I stared at her, my pulse steady, but slow like a drum before battle. "What exactly is he planning?" I asked. Claire's eyes darted to the door, then back to me, her mouth trembling open but no sound escaping. The fear in her face told me the answer would not just be about money or pride or renovation. It would be darker. And just then, a car's headlights swept across the front windows, stopping in the drive. The sound of an engine idling carried through the night air. Claire went pale. "It's him!" The headlights cut across the living room walls, throwing long shadows over the photographs on the mantel. Claire froze her eyes, locked on the door. I felt the air thicken like a storm pressing down before it breaks. The knock came quick, 3 hard raps. I stood my knees aching as I moved towards the door, but Claire caught my sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. "He'll twist whatever you say." I pulled free. "This is my house." He knocks on my door, I answer. When I opened it, Mark stood there, tall and confident, a smile carved into his face like he had rehearsed it. Behind him, his car idled exhaust curling into the night. "Well, there you are," he said, brushing past me without waiting for an invitation. I was starting to think we'd need a locksmith to get in. Claire flinched. I shut the door slowly, locking it, the click sounding louder than it should. Mark looked around the room, his eyes scanning the walls, the furniture, the family photos like an appraiser tallying values. "Nice place," he said with a smirk, settling into my chair as if it were his. "Feels like home already." The gall of it churned my stomach. I watched him lean back, fingers drumming the armrest I had worn down with years of use. My daughter stood small beside the table, twisting her hands, not daring to sit. Mark looked at her, then at me. "So, she told you." I didn't answer. Silence is sometimes the only way to make a man keep talking, and sure enough, he filled it. "We've got plans, big ones. This house is the cornerstone. You can't hold on to it forever, old man. Best to step aside now while we can still make something of it." I saw red creeping at the edges of my vision. Not from rage alone, but from memory. I remembered the first time I met him, standing awkwardly on my porch with cheap flowers in hand, calling me sir with a grin too wide. I remembered shaking his hand at their wedding, my wife whispering in my ear that maybe he was a bit slick, but give him a chance. I remembered the barbecue years later when he pitched some investment scheme to my neighbors, puffed up and loud, and I knew then he was the kind of man who could charm his way into someone's wallet. Now that same man sat in my chair speaking as if my life's work was already his. Claire's voice broke the silence. "Mark, stop." He ignored her. "I spoke with some people today. The bank's on us, sure, but once we get this property secured, everything changes. We've got leverage then. You don't see it, but you're sitting on opportunity. The kind of thing wasted on someone who clings to the past." I clenched my jaw. "You mean wasted on someone who earned it?" His smile faltered for a moment, but he recovered quick. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Claire deserves better. Your grandkids deserve better. That cut deeper than he knew. The grandkids, Ethan and Lily, two bright faces that used to run through these halls tugging at my hands, asking for stories at bedtime. They hadn't been by in months. Claire always had excuses. Too much schoolwork. Too many activities, too far a drive. Maybe it was Mark steering that ship, keeping them away, until the house was ready to be theirs. The thought made my throat tighten. I turned to Claire. Is that what you believe too? That your kids deserve this house more than the man who built it? Her eyes welled, but she said nothing. Silence again, cutting sharper than any reply. Mark leaned forward, seizing the pause. Look, we can all benefit if you just sign. We'll keep you comfortable. You won't want for anything. But fight us, and it gets messy. Lawyers, banks, neighbors. Do you really want your name dragged through all that at your age? The arrogance in his voice was gasoline on already rising flames. My heart thudded heavy, but I forced myself to stay steady. I would not let him see me falter. You talk a lot about comfort, I said slowly, but all I hear is greed. His smile snapped his face, hardening. You're damn right I want more. And Claire deserves it too. She's put up with enough scraping by while you sit on assets you don't even use. Claire's cheeks flushed. Mark, she started, but he raised a hand, silencing her. That gesture, that small flick of authority told me all I needed to know about the state of their marriage. I thought of my wife again. She would have stood between us, eyes blazing, defending the dignity of this home with words sharper than knives. Instead, it was me alone, facing a son-in-law who saw my years not as wisdom, but as weakness. The room felt suffocating, the air too thick. Mark leaned back, crossing his legs like a man already victorious. The lamp cast his shadow long across the rug, stretching toward me like a hand reaching to snatch everything I had left. Then the phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the tension. I stepped past him, my body stiff, and lifted the receiver. "This is Riverbend Realty again," the woman's voice said brightly. "We just wanted to confirm the showing for tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock. Does that still work for you, Mr. Harris?" I glanced over my shoulder. Mark's face had drained of color. Claire's lips parted in shock. "Yes," I said clearly into the receiver. 10 o'clock works." When I hung up, the silence was thunderous. Mark stood, fists tightening at his sides. "What the hell did you just do?" The twist was there, sharp and undeniable. The house was already in motion, and the control he thought he had was slipping through his fingers. Mark's voice rose like a blade scraping against steel. "You had no right to set that appointment." "None." He jabbed a finger toward me, his face flushed, veins swelling at his neck. Claire stood rooted near the table, caught between us eyes, darting as though the walls might close in. I did not answer right away. I lowered myself into the chair opposite him, feeling the weight of the years pull hard against my bones. Inside, though, my chest was hollow, like something had been scooped out. The sound of the Realtor's cheerful voice still echoed in my head, mingling with the memory of Claire's laughter from the day before. Both sounds, bright on the surface, carried poison beneath. "I had every right," I said, finally, my voice low. "This house is mine, always has been." Mark leaned forward, sneering. Not for long. The words landed heavy, and I felt a tremor run through me. For the first time in this battle, I let the weight press down. My hand gripped the arm of the chair, not for show, but to steady myself against the tide rising inside. Because beneath all his arrogance and greed, there was a truth I could not shake. Time was not on my side. No matter how strong my will, years were catching me faster than I cared to admit. I closed my eyes a moment, and memory came rushing in. Claire, as a little girl, her hair in messy braids, holding my hand as we walked to the corner store for penny candy. Her laughter when I carried her on my shoulders at the county fair. Her tiny arms clinging to me at her mother's funeral, her tears soaking through my shirt. Those moments felt carved into me deeper than anything Mark could say. Yet here she stood silent, watching her husband dismantle the life that had built her. My chest ached, not from age alone, but from grief. This was the collapse I never thought would come, not from illness, not from strangers, but from the child I had loved more than my own breath. I opened my eyes. "Claire," I said, my voice breaking. "You used to sit on my lap in this chair. You'd tug at my ear until I read another story. You used to say this was the safest place in the world. And now you let him spit on it on me." Tears welled in her eyes, but still she said nothing. That silence was worse than any insult. It was permission. Mark scoffed. "Enough of this sob story. You're clinging to memories, and memories don't pay the bills. The future does. And the future doesn't have your name on it anymore." I felt something crack inside, brittle as dry wood. My hands trembled on the chair arms, not from fear, but from the sharp cut of betrayal. For a moment I wanted to stand and shout, to tear down the photographs from the mantel, to smash the old clock that ticked uselessly through these humiliations. But I stayed still because anger would only feed him. Instead, I stared at him until he looked away. His confidence flickered just enough for me to see the cracks in his armor. "I know about the debts," I said quietly. Claire showed me the letter. His head snapped back toward her. "You did what?" She flinched under his glare. I couldn't hide it anymore. He had to know. Mark's face twisted, and for the first time fear passed over Claire's features. He took a step toward her, but I rose from my chair, slow but steady my frame, filling the space between them. "You touch her in this house and you'll answer to me," I said, my voice graveled by years of work and sorrow. He stopped, nostrils flaring, fists tight. The air pulsed thick between us, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. In that silence, another memory struck me hard. Claire at 16, crying in the driveway after her first heartbreak. Me wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, promising no man would ever hurt her if I could help it. And now here she was, bound to a man who saw her as a pawn in his schemes. The wound deepened. Not only had she turned against me, she had let herself be swallowed by him. Mark's voice dropped to a hiss. "You think you've won something that's showing tomorrow it won't happen. I'll see to it." The clock ticked on, mocking in its rhythm. Claire's tears slid down her cheeks, silent as rain. My chest burned with equal parts fury and despair, but beneath it, a resolve began to harden. "You'll see to nothing," I said, though. My voice cracked under the weight of it. Mark smirked, a dark gleam in his eyes. "You don't even know what's already been signed." The words froze me where I stood. I searched his face, and for the first time he looked like a man holding a hidden card. "What did you sign?" I asked, the air sharp in my throat. Claire's eyes widened, and her lips parted in sudden realization. "Mark, tell me you didn't." He smiled, then slow and cruel. "Let's just say the bank isn't the only one with papers in play." The room seemed to tilt under my feet. My daughter gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And for the first time I realized this fight might already have spilled beyond the walls of this house. The words hung there heavier than the walls themselves. "The bank isn't the only one with papers in play." Mark leaned back in my chair, smug and sure, like he had just set fire to the last bridge I had standing. Claire stood frozen beside the table, tears glinting on her cheeks, staring at him as if she no longer recognized the man she married. I felt the floor sway beneath me, the weight of years pressing down. For a breath, I nearly let it crush me. A lifetime of labor, of saving, of building, all threatened by a slick smile and a forged signature. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt myself sinking into the pit he wanted me in, the pit, where old men are powerless and forgotten. But then something else rose in me, quiet at first, then steady like the hum of the furnace in winter. A memory me standing at the factory line 40 years ago, the foreman telling us the plant was closing, that we were out of work. I remembered how I'd gone home, sat at this very table and told my wife I'd find another way. And I had. I always had. We had survived layoffs, hospital bills, lean winters, and grief. We had survived everything. And I had not survived all of that just to bow now. I straightened my back. The ache in my knees reminded me of who I was, not what I had lost. Those papers Mark spoke of, whatever trick he thought he held, were not the end. They were fuel. If he was willing to forge, then he was vulnerable. And if Claire had seen the letter from the bank, she had seen the cracks in his walls too. "Show me," I said, finally, my voice calm. "Show me these papers you're so proud of." Mark's smile faltered. Just for a second, but I saw it. He didn't have them with him. He had bluffed, waiting for fear to do the rest. Another time he muttered, "Standing. When it matters." I watched him move to the door, but this time I did not feel small. This time I felt the shape of a plan forming in the dark corners of my mind. I would not wait for him to dictate the terms. If there were papers floating around, I would find them. If signatures had been faked, I would uncover them. The house had always been my fortress, but I realized now it had to become my weapon. Every bill I had paid, every receipt I had saved, every record tucked into drawers and boxes in the attic, those were shields stronger than locks. If he thought he could write me out of my own life with ink, I would answer with every page of proof I had kept through the decades. Mark pulled the door open, muttering something under his breath, but I barely heard. My focus had shifted. For the first time in days, I felt not collapse, but rise. When the door shut behind him, Claire broke down. She dropped into the chair, her sobs spilling into her hands. "Dad, I don't know who he is anymore," she whispered through broken breaths. "I don't know how it got this far." I lowered myself into the chair across from her. For a long while I just looked at her, the lines of pain carved into her face, the little girl still flickering behind her eyes. "You chose him," I said quietly. "But you're still my daughter. If you want to stand with me, I'll fight for you. If you stand with him, I'll fight against you. Either way, I'll fight." Her sobs quieted, and she lifted her face. There was fear there, but also something else, relief. "I want to stand with you," she whispered. The words struck me like a beam of light cutting through a storm. Yet I knew words alone would not hold. She had been under his sway too long, her loyalty tested too many times. Still, it was enough to steady me. Enough to give me purpose. I rose, went to the hall closet, and pulled down an old metal box, dented and heavy. I carried it back to the table, set it down with a thud, and opened it. Inside lay decades of paperwork. Deeds, tax records, insurance slips, the kind of clutter most men toss out when the years roll on. Not me. I had kept it all, every line, every stamp. Claire stared at the stack, her tears slowing. "You kept everything." I nodded. A man who builds his life brick by brick doesn't throw away the mortar. I sifted through, finding the deed crisp. Though yellowed with age, my name printed bold. I slid it across the table toward her. "This is what they'll never take from me. From us. Not by bluffing, not by lying, not by laughing in my face. Her hands hovered over it, as if afraid it might burn. The clock ticked steady, the house listening. My mind sharpened with each second. I knew what had to be done. Tomorrow's showing with the Realtor was no longer just a formality. It was my chance to pull this fight into the open, to drag Mark's lies into the light, where neighbors, friends, and strangers could see the truth. I looked at Claire. "You'll be here tomorrow? You'll hear what's said, and you'll stand by me when the truth comes out." She nodded slowly, then firmly. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. The weight had not vanished, but I carried it differently now, like armor instead of chains. Then headlights swept across the window again, but this time they did not stop in the drive. They slowed, lingered, then rolled on. A chill ran through me. Someone else was circling, watching the house in the dark. The morning came with a sky the color of steel. I woke before the sun sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and laid out the papers like a general arranging maps before battle. The deed, the tax records, old receipts, even photographs of me working on the house in its early years, hammer in hand, and Claire no older than 6 at my side. Proof not just of ownership, but of blood and sweat poured into every beam. Claire joined me quietly, her hair pulled back, her eyes ringed from a night without sleep. She looked older than she had yesterday, as though the weight of truth had aged her in hours. She sat without speaking, but her presence was answer enough. At 10 sharp, a car pulled into the drive. Helen from Riverbend Realty stepped out, folder tucked under her arm, her expression brisk and professional. She smiled when I opened the door, unaware of the storm inside. "Morning, Mr. Harris," she said. "We'll do a quick walkthrough, then I'll bring the prospective buyers by at 10:30. I nodded, ushered her in, and let her begin her inspection. She commented on the hardwood floors, the solid foundation, the character of the place. I followed steady, but my ears strained for the sound I knew would come. It did. Another car pulling in, tires crunching on gravel. Then a door slammed. Mark's voice carried before he even stepped inside. "What the hell is this?" He burst through the door, face red, his tie loose like he had yanked it on in a rush. Behind him, 2 neighbors had paused on the sidewalk, drawn by the commotion. Helen looked up, startled. "And you are?" "I'm the owner," Mark declared, puffing himself tall. "There must be some mistake." Helen blinked, glanced at me, then at Claire. I pulled the deed from my folder and held it steady in my hand. "The only mistake is the lie he's been telling." Mark's confidence cracked. He reached for the paper, but I pulled it back. "This house is mine," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "My name is on the deed. Always has been." The neighbors outside shifted closer, listening through the open door. Helen's brows furrowed, her professional calm, giving way to unease. Mark turned on Claire. "You told him you showed him the letter?" She swallowed hard but lifted her chin. "I did. Because you've been lying to me too." His jaw tightened, a flash of panic in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to side with me. Not here, not in front of witnesses. Helen spoke carefully. "Mr. Harris is the registered owner. If there are conflicting claims, they'll need to be resolved legally. But as far as this listing goes, it's valid." Mark barked a laugh, high and brittle. "Legally? You think a piece of paper is going to stop me? He's senile. He doesn't even know what he's signing anymore." That was the moment the switch flipped in me. I felt years of patience, of quiet endurance funnel into a single surge. I stepped closer, my voice steady, but sharp enough to cut. "I know exactly what I'm signing, and I know exactly what I haven't. You talk about papers, but you don't have them. Because they don't exist. Or if they do, they're forged, and you'll answer for that." The room went still. Even Helen's pen paused above her notes. The neighbors leaned in the doorway, whispering among themselves. Mark's face lost its color, his bluff torn wide. You can't prove that he said, but the strength was gone from his tone. I said, and I will. I laid the deed flat on the table, my name bold against the yellowed page. Claire placed her hand beside it, silent but firm, the gesture louder than any words. Mark's breathing quickened his eyes, darting from the papers to the door, to the neighbors watching. The walls he'd built with arrogance and deceit were crumbling, and he knew it. But then something flickered in him, a last spark of desperation. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded document, waving it like a torch. "Then explain this," he said, slapping it onto the table. Helen picked it up, scanning quickly. Her brows shot up. "This is a quitclaim deed, signed by you, Claire." The blood drained from her face. "What? No, I never." But there it was, her name scribbled across the bottom in shaky ink. Mark smiled again, the cruelty returning to his eyes. "Looks like you don't know your own daughter as well as you thought." Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's not my signature." I stared at the paper, my heart pounding. The signature was close, too close. But I had seen her write 1,000 grocery lists, school permission slips, birthday cards. I knew the way her letters curled. This was not hers. I looked up at Mark, and in his eyes I saw it, just for a flash fear. He had played his card too soon. I turned to Helen. "Get a good look at that. Because when this goes to the police, you'll remember today as the day you saw the forgery with your own eyes." Mark's face contorted. "You don't have proof." I stepped forward close enough to smell the sweat breaking on his skin. "I have 30 years of her handwriting, and I'll bring every scrap of it if I have to." The room felt electric, neighbors whispering, Helen scribbling notes, Claire trembling but standing firm. For a moment I thought he might bolt. Instead, he shoved back from the table, knocking over a chair, and stormed towards the door. He paused, hand on the knob, and turned his head just enough to spit the words. "You'll regret this." Then he was gone, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. But as the echoes faded, Claire turned to me, her face pale. "Dad, you don't understand. If he's desperate enough to forge my name, he's desperate enough to do worse. You don't know what he's capable of." The house held its breath after he stormed out. Claire gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white, her chest rising and falling like she had run a mile. Helen gathered her folder eyes wide with the kind of awareness that comes when a simple job shifts into dangerous territory. The neighbors lingered on the porch, whispering, reluctant to leave. I walked to the door and locked it, the sound sharp in the stillness. "He's not finished," I said quietly. Claire turned to me, voice breaking. "You don't know what he'll do when he's cornered." I met her eyes. "Then he's already lost. A man only lashes out like that when he knows the ground is gone beneath him." But even as I spoke, I felt a shadow stir. I had seen men like Mark before, back in the plant when layoffs came and desperation twisted good workers into thieves. I had seen eyes turn hard, fists fly, dignity dissolve into violence. Desperate men didn't walk away, not until they had burned something down. Helen cleared her throat. "Mr. Harris, I'll be honest with you. I'll have to file a report on what I just saw. That document looked suspicious at best. If it's forged, the law will catch it." I nodded. "File it. Let the law do what it can." Then I looked at Claire. But some lessons don't come from papers. They come from truth laid bare. Her face crumpled. "I should have stopped him sooner. I let him tell me this house was ours. I let him speak for me. I didn't fight him until it was too late." I stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You forgot who you were, but you remembered in time. That's what matters now." Her tears spilled hot and heavy. Dad, I don't deserve your forgiveness." The words hit me deep like a blade turning in an old wound. I thought of the nights I rocked her to sleep, the scraped knees I kissed better the pride in my chest when she walked across that graduation stage. A father's heart does not turn to stone, no matter how sharp the betrayal. "You're my daughter," I said. "That's not something I can take back. But forgiveness, that has to be earned." The sound of an engine cut through the air outside, stopping us cold. Tires crunching gravel, headlights slicing across the curtains. My body stiffened. Claire clutched my arm. The front door rattled once hard. Then again. His voice came low and venomous through the wood. "Open it, old man." I stood still, breathing deep, the pulse in my ears steady as a drum beat. Helen whispered, "Should I call the police?" "Yes," I said, eyes locked on the door. "Do it now." Claire pulled the phone from her purse hands, trembling as she dialed. Mark's fist slammed the door again, rattling the frame. "You think you've beaten me. You think a piece of paper makes you stronger than me." I moved toward the door, not to open it, but to stand firm before it. "It's not the paper," I called out, my voice steady. "It's the truth. And that's something you can't forge." There was a pause, a silence heavy enough to crush breath. Then his laugh, sharp and unhinged. "Truth doesn't pay debts. Truth doesn't keep the lights on. You'll learn that soon enough." The neighbors' voices murmured outside, gathering, now their footsteps crunching as more came to watch. Claire clung to me, her voice whispering desperate prayers. Helen pressed the phone to her ear, speaking quickly. Then with a crack, the doorframe splintered. Mark had thrown his shoulder into it, forcing it open an inch. The chain lock held, but barely. His eye appeared in the gap, wild and darting. "You're done," he shouted. And then red and blue lights washed over the yard, sirens rising. Patrol cars swung in fast doors, slamming voices barking commands. Mark froze, his eye widening in the gap. "Step away from the door," the officer shouted. Mark hesitated, then backed off slowly. Hands raised, his shadow shrinking as the lights swallowed him. Claire collapsed into the chair, sobbing with relief. Helen lowered the phone, exhaling sharply. I remained at the door, my hand resting against the wood, the tremor in my chest, fierce and raw. The storm had broken, but the air was not clear. Not yet. Through the window, I saw Mark on the lawn, hands cuffed, shouting hoarse protests as officers pushed him towards the car. But then his eyes lifted, meeting mine through the glass, burning with a promise that chilled me. Because even as they led him away, his lips formed the words only I could read. "This isn't over." When the yard emptied of flashing lights and restless voices, the house sank into a silence so thick I could almost hear it breathe. Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, her body curled small, as if she were a child again, and the weight of the night had finally broken her down to something raw and simple. Helen had left hours earlier, promising to return with reports filed, and signatures examined her eyes, full of quiet respect I hadn't expected from a stranger. The neighbors had drifted back to their porches, their whispers carried away by the cold air. I sat at the kitchen table, the deed lying flat before me, my name printed bold and certain across a page older than my daughter's marriage. The house seemed to hum around me, boards creaking soft, as if the walls themselves approved of the night's outcome. Yet victory was not what I felt. What I felt was older, deeper, the ache of a man who had seen the cost of family gone astray, and still longed for the bond that once held us together. I thought of my wife. How she used to move through this kitchen, her footsteps light, her voice steady when she spoke of raising the children to be kind, to honor what was given to them. She believed a family was a covenant, a promise stronger than contracts and documents. I could almost hear her now asking me not to harden, not to let anger turn to stone in my chest. Self-respect. That was what this house had come to mean. Not just walls or bricks or the oak tree outside, but the truth that a man's labor, his quiet sacrifices deserved to stand without being stripped away. I realized, staring at that deed, that the house itself was only part of it. The greater fight was for the dignity that no one should surrender, not even to blood. But forgiveness, that was the stone I carried hardest. Claire's tears, her whispered confession, her trembling hand over mine as she chose at last to stand with me. How could I not feel the tug of mercy? Then I saw the little girl she had been flicker through the woman bent under her husband's shadow, and I knew that forgiveness was not weakness. Forgiveness was the bridge back to love, even if it took years to rebuild the road that led there. Justice, though, had its own voice, and it did not whisper. Justice meant exposing Mark's lies, dragging his forgeries into daylight, where the law could cut them down. Justice meant that neighbors saw that truth spread, that arrogance found its end. Yet I also knew that justice, bare and cold, could not heal a family alone. That part would rest in long talks, quiet mornings, maybe even shared grief over what had been lost. I reached for the coffee pot, though it had gone cold, poured a cup anyway, and let the bitter taste sit on my tongue. Outside, dawn edged the horizon, a pale light brushing over the oak tree that had seen every season of my life. It stood as it always had, roots deep, branches scarred by storms, yet still reaching upward. In its silence, I heard what I needed most, a reminder that endurance is its own kind of victory. Claire stirred on the couch, her eyes half opening. "Dad," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I'm here," I said, and she relaxed again, drifting back to sleep. I looked at her face, the lines of pain etched there, but also the faint peace of someone who had chosen truth over lies. That was a start. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking under me, and let the weight of the night settle into memory. My heart was tired but not broken. What I carried now was something sharper than despair and steadier than anger. It was the quiet knowledge that a man's worth does not end when others dismiss him. It rests in what he has built, in the respect he holds for himself, in the courage to stand even when those closest to him try to cut him down. The law would handle Mark. Time would handle the wounds between father and daughter. And as for me, I would keep living in this house not as a fortress against betrayal, but as a place where dignity had been defended, where lessons had been carved into wood and stone. I let my eyes close for a moment, listening to the tick of the hallway clock, steady as ever. Life had been reduced to minutes and hours to debts, and claims to words said in anger and silence given in fear. Yet it was still mine. And as long as breath filled me, I would hold it close. Thanks for listening to the story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment to let us know what you think.